So, we'll be going over 6 lines of evidence that provide support for biological evolution. And one that we did cover was the direct observation of evolution through artificial selection, which was evident in the domestication of dogs from wolves. Second piece, which we'll be going over next, is fossil evidence, then shared characteristics among living organisms, similarities and differences in DNA, biogeographic evidence, and common patterns of embryo development. And so, nowhere is all this evidence more present than in one of the most dramatic transitions to occur on Earth, and that is the evolution of small land living mammals into dolphins and whales and porpoises. So, that is the subject of what we have been doing, and that's the theme. So, for this next piece of evidence, fossils are basically the mineralized remains or impressions of formerly living organisms. And so, here are different examples. Right here are just the soft bodied animals of one dominant life form. The middle here shows a fossil of trilobites, and these are organisms that are pretty dominant throughout the fossil records, and they are no longer present. They're extinct, but there are many fossilized remains of them of various sizes. Here is a fossilized remain of a fern, and here is a fly, an insect, I'm sorry, excuse me, termite that's been preserved in amber. And here's a velociraptor, and even just as above here, plants can be fossilized, but in this case, it's petrified wood. So what we see here is different fossils that are preserved in rock, preserved bones, something preserved in amber, but footprints may be fossilized, as well as remains that are preserved in ice. So any remains of what would have been former living organisms. So going back to the scientist in our previous class that we were discussing, the Wilson, who discovered a fossil of what of a terrestrial organism that had an ear bone similar to that of a whale. He visited an area between Pakistan and India in a heavily disputed territory known as Kashmir. And he had made friends with a widow of a geologist who had a lot of fossils. And this fossil was Indohyus, the very first fossil that we discussed at the beginning of our chapter. So the fossil records enables biologists to basically reconstruct the history of life on Earth. And it provides us really with the strongest evidence of species that have evolved over time. Charles Darwin also had looked at fossil evidence, and that helped him in his formulation of the theory of evolution by natural selection. The relative depth or distance from the surface of Earth at which a fossil can be found also indicates its order in the fossil record. And so the ages of fossils correspond to their order. So the older fossils are found in deeper, older rock layers. So the deeper the rock layer, the older the fossils that would be found within that specific rock layer. And we refer to each layer as what is called a stratum. So deeper strata strata is the plural of stratum, and deeper rock layers corresponds with older fossils. The fossil record contains really excellent examples of how major new groups of organisms would have arisen from previously existing organisms. And so, what we referred to those as would be transitional fossils. And those are basically intermediate fossils. And those transitional fossils or intermediates provide evidence of species with some similarities to the ancestral group, which would have been land living mammals, and some similarities to the descendant species, which in this case would have been whales. So, going back to the scientists that discovered that fossil of what was similar to the ear bone, the Wisson had spent decades studying those intermediates, from the first known whale to a transitional form to the fully aquatic form, which we'll see on the next slide. So this diagram here displays the reconstructed skeletons from modern whales, which are at the top, and various ancestors there in chronological order. So our scientists, the Wissons, spent decades studying these intermediates. So the first known whale, which is right here, is Pakicetus, and that basically waded in shallow fresh water. And then we can proceed upwards here to Ambulocetus. And this kind of resembled, probably just resembled physiologically, a crocodile that would have stalked its prey underwater. And then if we go here, this is Durodon that would have been fully aquatic with a blowhole, flippers, and tail. And I really like this visual because it presents the skeletal structure on this left-hand side. It presents this what's called a phylogenetic tree. And the other thing that I really like is it presents the relative size of all of these various forms. So from Pakicetus here to Durodon to the modern whale all the way up here, you can see how Pakicetus here, which was basically kind of the size of our cat today, has really evolved to be this humongous whale today. So the Wisson had made several different trips to Kashmir. He had made friends with a widow of a geologist in Kashmir. And this widow was very reluctant to give up the fossils to anyone, and she had protected them. But as the Wisson had come to befriend her, she would become more willing to share them. In 2007, she passed away, and she made the Wisson a co-trustee of her estate. And suddenly the fossils, which had basically sat within her estate for 30 years, were now available to study. So Thewisson was then able to bring them back to the United States, and he was able to bring these fossils back to his team. And the team was able to proceed with the task of separating the fossils from the rocks. And they were able to identify more than 400 bones that belonged to this guy here, Indohyus. And they collected a thigh bone here and a jawbone there, but they basically compiled a skeleton of a single Indohyus individual. So here are some questions. What is the general definition of a fossil? How are the ancestors of modern whales different from their present form? What is meant by the term intermediate fossil when referring to the fossil record? So the Wisson and his team, like I said, identified more than 400 bones that belonged to Indohyus, and that's shown here. And they assembled a skeleton and had an artist's depiction of Indohyus illustrated. So, but what was most notable is the discovery of the whale like ear. So the researchers looked even more carefully at the features of the fossils, and they found additional evidence that Indohyus was a relative of whales. And what is notable about the ear, and we keep going back to the ear bone, is that the ear bone in whales is pretty special because it allows whales to hear underwater. So the ear bone that was found in Indohyus has hooved feet that allow it to walk on water, yet it has an ear bone that allows it, excuse me, I'm sorry, it has hooved feet that allows it to walk on land, yet it has an ear bone that allows it to hear underwater. So it is this transitional form. So Indohyus is this little animal, and as you saw on the previous slide, it has a pointy snout and slender legs that have hooves at the ends, and it was able to live close to water, and it had an affinity for water. There were certain clues about its lifestyle that came from its teeth. So the features of fossils provided additional evidence that Indohyus was a relative of whales. So we made several notes about its ear bones, but there's several clues that came from various isotopes. So oxygens in the molecules that make up teeth in general come from the water and foods that an animal ingests. So levels of oxygen isotopes in Indohyus's teeth match those of our current water-dwelling mammals. So that was an indication that Indohyus lived near water and would have spent a significant amount of time in water. It was also evident that it had large crushing molars with kind of like basins in its teeth. And so if you look here, you can see that there are, so this is like, if you compare the skulls, right, and jaws of fossilized Indohyus and modern hippopotamus, there are these crushing basins in its teeth, and that's similar to the hippopotamus. Um, so that allows for it to eat plants, again, similar to hippos and muskrats. So as you can see here. So again, here at the top are these crushing basins within the teeth for Indohyus, and then here with the hippopotamus. But there was another special thing about Indohyus. So there was a graduate student in Lewison's lab at the time, and what she identified was another adaptation to water. And this was specifically in Indohyus's leg bones. So from the outside, the limbs of Indohyus looked like those basically of any other mammal that would have walked on land. But on the inside, there was something different. So the graduate student basically cut out a section of bone from the limb, ground it down until she was able to see light through it, and then looked at the bone under a microscope. And she saw that a thick layer of the bone was wrapped around the bone marrow. So at the time in the laboratory, they had lots of bones of the earliest whales. So those other whales had extraordinarily thick bones. And what's important to note is that modern animals that live in shallow water, such as manatees and hippos, also have thick bones. And that's something that helps prevent them from floating and enables them to dive quickly. So it's not just isolated to whales, but bones have thickened again and again as different groups of vertebrates entered the water. So when you trace them back through the fossil record, there's a pretty good correlation between thickness of bone and whether something was living in the water. So Indo-Hyas thick bones are an example of what we call an adaptive trait. And that's a feature that gives an individual improved function in a competitive environment. So, by being able to easily wade and dive in water, Indo-Hyas had an advantage over other organisms in escaping predators and accessing plants to eat on the river floor. And adaptive traits can take many forms. But here, when we look at the cross sections of the different bones, here we see Pakicetus, and you see a relatively heavy bone, right? Because that was dwelling in water. Here's the manatee, also a water-dwelling mammal and also a thick bone. Here's Indo-Hyas, the subject of our conversation right now. But if you compare that to these two land-dwelling mammals, you see that there's more space and they're not as thick. So let's continue on to the next slide here with these questions. So why do water-dwelling animals have thicker bones than land-dwelling animals? Why does this thick bone adaptation suggest a water-dwelling lifestyle? And how did this adaptation likely increase survival or reproduction in Indo-Hyas? Now, adaptive traits can take many forms. So, for example, there's echolocation in bats, and that's an adaptation for catching insects in the dark. Or something like this stick insect, and that's physically and behaviorally mimicking the plants that they live on. And that's an adaptation that helps them avoid detection by predators. So they're well adapted to their environment and they move slowly and look just like the branches that they live upon. So we can look at the ultimate family trait. Thick bones are not restricted to just our water loving ancestors of whales, as we had noted, but they can be seen in many other mammals, such as hippos. So, this similarity across organisms is another type of evidence for evolution, and that is shared characteristics among species. Many shared characteristics, such as thick bones for animals that take to shallow water, or sexual reproduction via egg and sperm, or eukaryotic cells. Uh, they all result from organisms sharing traits that evolved from a common ancestor, an organism from which many species evolved. And a group of organisms have common descent if they share a common ancestor. So, when one species splits into two, the two resulting species have these similar features. And those similar features are homologous traits, which we'll get to next. So, like we had just noted, when one species splits into two, the two resulting species share similar features or homologous traits because they have common descent. So, though those features may begin to look different from one another over time, um, for example, whales are so different from humans that it can be difficult to identify similarities. But we evolved from a common mammalian ancestor and do share homologous traits. Humans and whales both nurse their young and have a single lower jawbone because our common ancestor had those traits. And if you look here, we have what is called a pentadactyl limb. And what is indicated in all these limbs is the bones that are similar. And if you look internally, it's a similar structure, although it serves a different function. And the function of the human arm is to grasp, the function of the whale flipper is to swim, the function of the bat wing is to fly. But even though there's a different function for all of these structures, internally, this pentadactyl limb is the same. So, homologous traits are shared characteristics inherited from a common ancestor. So, we have, again, the human arm, the whale flipper, and the bat wing, and they're all homologous structures due to common descent. And all these three structures have a matching set of 5 digits and a matching set of arm bones that have been altered by evolution for different functions. And there's other homologous structures. And there could even be homologous sets of DNA. Mammary glands can be homologous, and egg laying in various animals can be homologous. So there is a variety of different examples. So here are some questions to consider. What is meant by the term common ancestor? Why are homologous structures among organisms evidence for evolution? And aside from skeletal structural similarities, what other commonalities among organisms might be considered homologous? So we can continue along with discussing shared characteristics among species and various traits. So vestigial traits are another type of trait that many organisms have because of a common ancestor. And these features are a piece of the evolutionary past, and that's inherited from a common ancestor but no longer used. Vestigial traits may appear as, so like if you see here, they may appear as reduced or just generally degenerated parts whose function is hard to discern. So, like for example, many modern whales, they just have vestiges, hence vestigial structures. They just have vestiges of thigh bones, which are also called femurs, embedded in the skin next to the pelvis. In land mammals, birds, and other tetrapod vertebrates, these bones are critical for walking, running, and jumping. Aquatic whales have no need for this bone, but we see that its traces remain. And whales also have small muscles devoted to non existent external ears, and that's likely from a time when they were able to move their ears as land mammals, such as dogs, do for directional hearing. So, vestigial traits are not adaptations, and in fact, they can sometimes be detrimental. So, most humans no longer need wisdom teeth to replace lost teeth during adolescence, yet most people still have them. They tend to erupt around 20 years old, often causing severe pain and displacing other teeth. And when that happens, we say that they're impacted and they usually require removal. So here we see that in the snake, the reduced hind legs are basically, again, vestiges of what would have been legs in its previous ancestor, hence vestigial traits or vestigial structures. And here are questions to consider. Why are vestigial structures among organisms evidence for evolution? Give an example of another vestigial structure. Are vestigial structures also homologous structures? Why do vestigial structures still exist if they are no longer useful? So there's clues in the genetic codes. So within the cells of every
Many modern whales, like their close relatives, dolphins and porpoises, contain small bones embedded in the skin where hind limbs would otherwise be. These bones are vestigial traits, which are reduced or degenerated remnants that have no apparent function. Yet if we follow the sequence of fossils from modern whales to ancient whale ancestors, or their relatives, about 50 million years ago, we find that these animals did have something obviously useful in the same location. They had complete hind limbs, good for walking, running, and jumping, for their life as four-legged land mammals. Heading back toward modern whales, notice that the hind limbs changed as the different groups became adapted to life in water. Here they function as paddles. In this ancient whale 40 million years ago, they are already nearly gone and completely disconnected from the spine. In the modern streamlined whale, the vestigial traits hint at what used to be. In whales, adapting to life in water has also resulted in the loss of external ears, leaving behind another vestigial trait. These animals still have small muscles devoted to their non-existent external ears, apparently from a time when their ancestors were able to move their ears, as land animals such as dogs do, for directional hearing. Whales, dolphins, and porpoises are not the only tetrapod vertebrates to have lost their hind limbs. Snakes have lost all their limbs. They evolved from four-legged lizards. However, some snakes, such as pythons, do have degenerated remnants of hind limbs, which are only barely visible externally. These vestigial structures, the remnants of the leg bones and pelvis, can be seen in the skeleton. What would cause once four-limbed animals to lose their hind limbs? Studies on the embryonic development of dolphins provide a clue. It turns out that early in dolphin development, both fore and hind limb buds begin to form. However, soon after initiation, while the forelimb buds are continuing to develop into flippers, the hind limb buds disappear. By looking at gene activity in the hind limb buds, scientists determined that genes that are normally active in the hind limb buds of four-limbed animals are turned off in the hind limb buds of dolphins. Therefore, a genetic change leading to the silencing of genes may have been an important milestone in the evolution of these aquatic mammals.
Organism is really one of the strongest pieces of evidence for evolution, the DNA. When Charles Darwin initially proposed his theory of evolution by natural selection, at the time that he had proposed this, he did not have knowledge about DNA. And just to give you an idea of when Charles Darwin existed, he shares the same birth date as Abraham Lincoln. So he didn't know about DNA. Yet he proposed this theory of evolution by means of natural selection at his time. And after that proposal of this theory, further scientific discoveries only reaffirm that. Whether it be the discovery of these transitional fossils, the discovery of the structure of DNA, all of this is yet even further evidence of evolution. So, living things universally use DNA as hereditary or genetic information. And the fact that all organisms on Earth, even those as different as bacteria or bananas or redwood trees and humans, use the same code, the same genetic code, is further evidence that the great diversity of living things evolved from a common ancestor. So, scientists have analyzed the DNA of whales and other animals and have determined that whales are most closely related to even-toed ungulates. And those are a group of hoofed animals that includes modern deer, giraffes, camels, pigs, and hippos. Indohyus is an example of an even-toed ungulate that's basically gone extinct. So these molecular studies therefore confirm that the prediction that whales and Indohyus do in fact share a common ancestor. So according to DNA sequence similarity, hippos are whales' closest living relatives, and whale DNA is more similar to hippo DNA than to the DNA of other marine mammals, such as seals and sea lions. And DNA sequence similarity is a measure of how closely related two DNA molecules are to each other. So, for example, in the DNA sequences of the same insulin gene in humans and mice, 83% of the nucleotides are identical at corresponding positions, as you see here. We share a more recent common ancestor with mice than we do with chickens, for whom the DNA sequence of the same gene is just 72% identical in ours. In fact, the insulin gene of our closest living relative on Earth, the chimpanzee, has in fact 98% similarity to the human insulin gene. So that comparability implies that humans and chimpanzees at least share a recent common ancestor. And the fact that there are these separate lines of evidence, whether it be anatomical features or DNA, yields the same result just over and over again for diverse groups of organisms. It's just strong evidence for evolution. So, to calculate the percentages, here we see that the chicken insulin gene, right, has 72% sequence similarity because out of the 333 nucleotides, 240 of them are identical. So 240 of 333 are identical nucleotides to a human. So that's 72% sequence similarity. Mouse insulin gene has 276 out of 333 identical nucleotides to a human and 83% sequence similarity. Chimpanzee insulin gene has 328 out of 333 identical nucleotides to human for a 98.4% sequence similarity. So consider these questions. If a sequence from another species showed a 96% sequence similarity to humans, would that species be more or less closely related to humans than chimpanzees are? Second question, should similarities in the DNA sequences of genes be considered evolutionary homology? Third question, how has the increased similarity in the DNA sequences of genes between more closely related organisms and the decreased similarity between less closely related organisms evidence for evolution? Use the example in this figure to support your answer. So overall, whale evolution is really one of the best case studies that documents how a vertebrate can go from a terrestrial to an aquatic environment. And another type of evidence that supports whale evolution comes from locations where whale fossils have been found. So let's consider the birthplace of whales. The Earth's continents are on massive tectonic plates, and these move slowly over time in a process called continental drift or plate tectonics. Now, about 250 million years ago, um, South America, Africa, and all the other land masses on Earth had drifted together to form one giant continent called Pangaea. And then about 200 million years ago, Pangaea slowly began to split up, separating to ultimately form the continents as we know them today. And that separation continues today. And so, for example, each year, South America and Africa drift farther apart by about an inch. We can use knowledge of evolution and continental drift to make predictions about the biogeography of a species, the geographic locations where its fossils will be found. So, for example, today, the lungfish, and this is its scientific name, where this first part is the genus, and the second part is the species name, is found only in northeastern Australia, but its ancestors lived during the time of Pangea. So, as predicted, therefore, fossils of these ancestors are found on all continents except Antarctica. So, the biogeography of whale fossils matches the pattern predicted by evolution. All early species of whales, such as the crocodile like Pakicetus, that lived in rivers and lakes but did not swim in the ocean, are found near India and Pakistan. So it makes sense. You don't have crocodiles crossing the Atlantic, but fossils of fully aquatic protocetids, which emerged about 40 million years ago, are geographically much more widespread. And those have been found as far away from Pakistan as Canada. So protocetids are good swimmers, so we can find their fossils all over the world. So if we look at this particular figure, this is the lungfish, and this species is currently found in only this particular orange shaded region of Australia. But each of these red dots indicate places where amphostery fossils have been found. And of course, these are the continents as we see them today. But about 250 million years ago, the continental plates had formed Pangea, but started drifting apart about 200 million years ago. So, to reiterate, the lungfish we see is just in this northeastern part of Australia. But we know that its ancestors lived during the time of Pangea. So because of that, we see fossils that are on the various continents. However, we do not see fossils that would be on Antarctica because that was not part of this land mass. So consider these questions. Why should we expect to find amphostery fossils all over the world, given that first evolved in Pangea? Second question, can we use biogeographic evidence to support evolution without using fossil evidence? Give examples. How might we use DNA evidence similarities together with biogeography as evidence for evolution? And finally, here, another piece of evidence for evolution. So, embryonic development. A major prediction of evolution is that organisms should carry within themselves evidence of their evolutionary past, and they do. So, evidence of evolution can be observed in shared patterns of embryonic development. Once again, these common patterns are caused by descent from a common ancestor. So, rather than evolving new organs from scratch, new species inherit structures that may have been modified in form and sometimes even in function. So, upon fusion of sperm and egg, an animal embryo begins to grow and develop. And the manner in which an embryo develops, especially at the early stages, may mirror early developmental stages of ancestral forms. So, for example, anteaters and some baleen whales do not have teeth as adults, but as fetuses they do. And the embryos of fishes, amphibians, reptiles, birds, and mammals, including humans, all develop pharyngeal pouches or gill slits. So, evolutionary history can be extrapolated from similarities in embryo development. And here we see the fish, the reptile, the bird, and the human embryo. So, these embryos, interestingly, all share gill slits and tails because fishes, reptiles, birds, and humans all evolved from some common ancestor that had these features. And these complex structures in descendant species are generally elaborations of structures that existed in their common ancestor. In fish, the pouches develop into gills that adult fish use to absorb oxygen underwater. And in human embryos, the same features become parts of the ear and the throat. So, some questions to consider. First, why are the similarities among organisms during early development evidence for evolution? Second, are the similar structures among vertebrate species during embryogenesis, so the development of embryo, homologous structures? Thirdly, why do embryonic structures still exist at points during embryogenesis if they are not used after birth? So, returning back to our researcher, Lewison, and the story of whale evolution, Lewison was interested to get embryos to look at some of the processes that we see happen in evolution to see if they happen in development. So, the first trait he examined was hind limbs. And so, we know from fossil evidence that early whales lose their hind limbs. So, he wondered if hind limbs exist in whale or dolphin embryos. And dolphins are also mammals and are closely related to whales. And if so, what makes them subsequently disappear before the animal is born? So, examining spotted dolphin embryos, the Lewison saw that when the embryos are the size of just a small pea, they do actually develop hind limb buds, but by the time they grow into the size of a bean, those limb buds are gone. And so, as recently as 2006, he and researchers at various universities took a closer look at genes that are active in whale and dolphin embryos and concluded that whales' hind limbs basically regressed over millions of years through small changes in a number of genes relatively late in embryonic development. The loss of hind limbs in the embryo corresponds to the disappearance of hind limbs in the fossil records. And so it was an interesting way to combine embryology with fossils. And within the next decades, they would then find that the development of fetal ear bones in the womb would parallel the changes that were observed in the fossil record. And so here again, you see in green where the forelimb develops, and that becomes the flippers. And here in purple, you see where the hind limb would develop, but it does not develop fully. And so, with their discovery of Indohyus, the Wisson and his team basically bridged a 10 million year gap in the fossil records, and they identified an important transition species to whales. And so, it's just yet another piece of evidence surrounding whale evolution. And that was just done really in the past, like 5 years ago, with the discovery of fossils from a new species, in a species of pygmy sperm whale found in Panama. I'm sorry, excuse me. Back like 5 years ago in 2015, there were fossils in of a extinct pygmy sperm whale that were found in Panama, and it just further confirmed this. So evolution is supported by mutually reinforcing independent lines of evidence, right? We talked about artificial selection, so you're able to directly observe it. We talked about the fossil record. We talked about shared characteristics like homologous structures and vestigial structures. We talked about DNA similarities and biogeographic evidence, and common patterns in embryonic development. So, just as the theory of gravity forms the foundation of physics, so evolution is a central tenet in biology. So, there's no question that evolution happens. So, the fascinating question is, how does it happen? And through the scientific research, we know that whales descended from a group of land living mammals, including the tiny Indohyus, who would just eat upon freshwater plants and living in the shallow water. But how would that population of small, furry animals eventually become the mammoths of the sea? And so that's what we'll be getting into next. So, multiple choice questions just to check upon your understanding. Can an individual evolve? Second question. There are animals that have DNA sequences for genes for some of the same proteins as humans do. What does this suggest? Third question. Which of the following is not evidence for evolution by natural selection? Next multiple choice question. If a homologous trait is no longer useful in a specific organism, then it is referred to scientifically by what term? Which of the following were adaptive traits of Indohyus?